Hi there. You are listening to Cinemagic Book Shots on YouTube, and we are continuing part 3 of Anne-Marie Rasmussen's book, There Was Once a Time of Islands, Illusions, and Rockefellers. This should be the final end of the part 3 of this book. So she continues to say, frequently I would call the seminary, have Stephen page, and joyfully remind him, I love you. I miss you so much. After a while, he asked me to please stop because the calls which he had to answer in front of the secretaries in the main office made him uncomfortable. But I do love you, Stephen. I know, and I'm grateful, Anne-Marie. But can't you please wait until I come home to tell me? He would ask. So that was one thing that he would do to her. And then another thing she mentions down here, despite all the disturbing thoughts about Catholicism that passed through my mind, I felt strongly drawn to the Pope. Teasingly, I asked Stephen if we should change our religion. But just as I posed the question, he whispered in my ear, Mia, look at that incredible face. I turned to see a young woman in a nun's habit with the most serene expression on her face. It seemed transfixed in an aura of holiness and purity. Okay. On page 142, she says, I came across a similar expression a few days later when we bought some postcards with reproductions of famous paintings of the Virgin Mary on them. Stephen observed that Mary's face resembled his mother's at the time of her wedding. After we were home, I asked to look at some of the family's albums. And when I saw Miss Rockefeller's wedding picture, I had to admit her face did bear some resemblance to the one on the postcards. Every time I saw a nun after that or looked at pictures of the Virgin Mary, I regretted that Stephen couldn't or didn't perceive a similar expression of inner calmness and peace on my face. Whatever quality he admired, I tried to incorporate into my being, usually in vain. Okay, so she is talking about they took a family trip. She said, we decided to leave a few days ahead of schedule. I arrived home unexpectedly early in the morning and went in to stand by Stephen's bed. He was so startled by my presence that for one split second, he didn't recognize me. When we went in to see little Stevie together, he didn't respond to me either until he heard me call his name. Then I received big smiles and hugs from both of them. It was good to be home, and we had a few weeks of uninterrupted harmony and peace. Our period of tranquility was shattered with the news that Governor and Mrs. Rockefeller were going to separate after 31 years of marriage. The headlines in the newspapers and the continual hourly reminders on the radio and television were most upsetting to me. I have always thought that separation and divorce were among the two worst things emotionally and morally that could happen to anyone. 24 hours after the separation was announced, sadness was compounded by tragedy. Michael was reported missing off the coast of New Guinea, that something bad could have happened to him almost inconceivably. He was too young, happy, and sure of himself, and I was convinced everything would turn out to be a false alarm. I can remember sitting in Terrytown listening to speculations about how he might have been eaten by crocodiles or, and this is Nelson Rockefeller with Jennifer and Ingrid, 1967. Here's Anne-Marie campaigning. Anne-Marie with her mother. There is Anne-Marie and Stephen. This is Stephen Rockefeller. This is Nelson Rockefeller's son. Here they are with King Olaf at 812 Fifth Avenue, May 11, 1968. Their horse, the cook, a Peruvian cook named Maria. Okay, so it says that he could have been eaten by crocodiles or cannibals, or how he might have drowned, but I believe that he was probably off somewhere exploring on his own, completely unaware that anyone was concerned about his safety. The governor and Mary, Michael's twin sister, flew directly to New Guinea to investigate. Michael had been on an expedition with a friend, a professor from Harvard University, Dr. Renee Wassing, and the catamaran in which they were traveling overturned. Wassing, who was rescued while still clinging to the craft, reported that Michael, probably because he knew he was a strong swimmer, had tried to make it to the shore to seek help. After an exhaustive search into all the possibilities, the governor sadly concluded that there was little tangible evidence that Michael might still be found alive, and he and Mary left for home. Stephen Rodman Rockefeller and I were driven in the official state limousine to the airport to meet them. The sadness engulfed as the chauffeur closed the door. After Mr. Rockefeller and Mary entered the car, we began our journey to Tarrytown in silence, overwhelmed by a shared emotion that did not lend itself to words. Then Governor Rockefeller squeezed my hand and held it for a long time as he expressed deep gratitude to all of us for coming. He began to speak of his love and admiration for Michael and how it had taken courage for him to pursue his quest of finding himself, a quest that had led him to delve into the primitive society of New Guinea. Perhaps Michael needed to get that far away from his comfortable life in order to put his personal identity into perspective. Mr. Rockefeller seemed to be searching for a purpose in the expedition, and he tried to help us, as well as himself, comprehend the reality that Michael might never come back. Miss Rockefeller's face looked grief-stricken as we entered her living room. And here is her other, this is their son and daughter sitting by the fire. Okay. Okay, so hello Nels, hello Todd, how are you? I am sorry to bring such tragic news back to you. After a long silence, Mr. Rockefeller carefully and slowly placed a large map of New Guinea on the floor in front of the fireplace. We all got down on our knees in a huddle to listen to his account of the futile search effort. The details were very somber, painful, brief. We were able to grasp the gravity of the situation, yet we looked at each other with unvoiced hopes for a miracle. As he was leaving, shaking his head in despair, Stephen's father kissed Miss Rockefeller on the cheek and said goodnight to her and then to the rest of us before he left for the big house where he had been residing since the separation. For some reason, I thought of all the other times I had witnessed Stephen's parents cordially saying goodnight to each other before Mr. Rockefeller walked to his private quarters. Now he had to get in his car and drive up the hill. When his father left, Stephen pulled his mother close to him and whispered kind words to her. He hugged and kissed her and said, Mother, in a tone of voice that still haunts me. I was happy for Miss Rockefeller at that moment because she had someone who could respond to her with a love that seemed tender, real, and nourishing. My mind filled with thoughts about the possible meaning of the two catastrophes taking place within the Rockefeller family. Mama wrote to me later that God was trying to tell the family something, and perhaps it would prove to be a way to reunite Stephen's parents. It didn't. Soon, Miss Rockefeller was on her way to Reno to establish her 6 weeks residence requirement for a Nevada divorce. I knew this was not something of her own choosing, and I admired the regal way in which she continued to carry herself, head always held high, with never a hint of desiring sympathy. They got a divorce. They were going through a divorce, and their son got eaten by cannibals. All in the name of finding himself instead of going at it at a healthier way, I guess. It says that Mary recovered enough from the traumatic events of the fall to go ahead with her plans to marry William Strawbridge, who came from a prominent Philadelphia family. The wedding was a joyful celebration for all of us. Billy seemed interesting and full of fun, and the prospect of sharing some good times with him and Mary was promising. Soon after the Strawbridges were wed, Stephen's father married Margaret Happy Murphy, also from Philadelphia, mainline. The service of the Little Union Church of Pocantico Hills was a simple affair. The Lawrence Rockefellers held a reception for the new bride and groom at their home on the estate. So both of their parents got remarried. Stephen's parents. Okay, it says Happy moved into Kaikouet, the big house, with the governor, and Mary and Billy took over the house next door to ours until they found a place in which to settle permanently. Miss Rockefeller began to look for a new residence off the estate. Her children encouraged her to stay where she had lived for 31 years, possibly putting in a private driveway or building a wall around her property, but it was probably too painful to be so close to the governor and his new bride, who had been a friend of hers as well, because she soon bought a lovely country estate in Westchester County, which she named Sardana. No one could have guessed what the word meant or what its derivation was, and whenever anyone asked, Miss Rockefeller would smile and say, "It's a secret." So, more secrets. Um, okay, later on, she says that she got pregnant again and that she wrote to Mama and asked her to come to America to spend some time with us during the long, languid days of summer before the baby was due. She was writing in her diary that she must be getting old. When I told Stephen how I felt, he said no matter what age I happened to be, I would always be beautiful to him, and added, don't you think that old trees are beautiful? Then he started talking about the bonsai trees in Japan. Um, so they made a birthday cake out of blueberries. Um, okay, so over here she's talking about where she says, I threw the lilies in the dustbin, accepted the fact that I was another year older, and suggested a trip into New York City to Mama. Stephen was going to go to a military meeting, and perhaps Mama and I could take a tour of the United Nations. So, this is the UN building. On the way, we stopped in Terrytown to buy Mama some comfortable walking shoes, but at first she refused to let the mail shoe clerk measure her foot. In the end, grudgingly, Mama allowed the man to fit her, and we were on our way with low-heeled shoes. We both needed them. Our private tour of the UN was long and interesting, but very tiring. Before it was over, I felt a wave of anxiety, thinking the baby might come ahead of time. I could only wonder what nationality it would be if it were born on the international soil donated by Rockefellers of the United Nations. As it turned out, my fears were unfounded, and we made it back to Terrytown without any difficulty. But the house was lonely without Stephen, even though Mama was here. Okay, over here. She says Stephen finally returned from that particular army meeting, and was relieved the baby had not been born before, had not been born while he was away. Soon after his arrival, we received a formal invitation to a reception at the Playhouse for the King of Thailand. When I saw that Benny Goodman was going to provide the entertainment, I asked Stephen if we would be going. I was near the end of my pregnancy, and he didn't know what we should do and suggested we ask his mother for advice. Miss Rockefeller thought it would not be in my best interest to attend the affair from the standpoint of either comfort or propriety. She told me the Queen of England never allowed herself to be photographed while she was pregnant. At first, I didn't see what that had to do with me, but I took a look at myself in the mirror and saw her point. I wonder if there's something more to that with the queen being all the stuff that's, going on with certain individuals in other countries and a bunch of trans stuff, if you get my drift. Um, it says The two of us were thrilled when our daughter, whom we decided to name Ingrid, was born on August 13th, 1963 at 2:42 p.m. Stephen had called Mama as soon as he arrived at the hospital to report on my progress. How long will it be, Stephen? About 2 or Louise, he tried to say in Norwegian. Even Mama had to laugh heartily as she reminded him that in Norwegian, R means year. Soon after I came home from the hospital, Stephen surprised me by buying us a brand new Ford station wagon. He said that with two babies, a nurse, the diaper pail, and all the other equipment we were transporting now, we really needed a newer and more roomy car. I couldn't get over the obvious luxury of a car that was big enough for all of us, plus branches and flowers for arrangements and firewood too. Okay, so it says that his main concerns about our future home were how to keep the cost down and how to keep the children to the master bedroom. I could understand his wish to keep the children close to us. He had been separated from his parents' quarters as a child, and he was also somewhat concerned about their safety and felt that the closer they were to us, the more protected they would be. Fears that would seem more neurotic to most people about kidnapping, for instance, are normal for the very rich. So, mm, all right. It says they kept going over sketches. The sketches continued to go back and forth between Boston and Tarrytown until 1 year before we separated, when Stephen decided to give up until he was certain about where his future would take him. At that point, I began to wonder if the dream house would ever amount to more than the playhouse I'd had as a child. It says we entertained more frequently now and had taken over the next place as a guest house. So Stephen agreed to hire some extra help. Maria, who came from Peru, has had a tendency to mispronounce names. She always called the strawberry bridges, although she was not exactly the image of a perfect servant. We all came to love her, especially the children and Stephen, for whom she seemed to have unlimited patience and feel a deep devotion. Um, I guess they finally got their house. It says the house was always filled with floral compositions. Okay. So the house was always filled with floral compositions, of which I was quite proud, and I received many compliments on them, especially from Miss Rockefeller. I had thought Stephen might appreciate the oriental touch of ikebana, especially in the dining room. But one day he said, Mia, you really ought to get a job running a museum. This is our home, which is meant to be enjoyed by all of us. And look, lived in, not arranged. I knew what he meant, but of course that did hurt a little. Besides, I really liked things my way. and I went right on doing things my way. So she was disobedient to him. Okay, so it says right here. The only part of the house I carefully avoided was Stephen's third floor study, which definitely had a lived in look, not to say a cluttered one. Every time I became brave enough to go up and take a peek, the sight made me shudder. I began to wonder if book publishers were ever thought of making bindings that would come size and color coordinated, but to Stephen, it simply didn't matter whether or not his favorite possession went together. In his little room were a bust of Robert Frost, an oil painting of the Grand Tetons, an etching of Abraham Lincoln, which looked very depressing to me, and the Picasso watercolor of the overweight nude woman putting on stockings, which he hung in his bathroom. So the governor's children's brothers, sisters, and in-laws were devoted to Mary Clark Rockefeller, and their loyalty was felt and expressed in many ways. But in spite of all the confused and uncertain feelings, everyone was polite and gracious to the new Miss Rockefeller. Feeling slightly uncomfortable myself and referring to her as Miss Rockefeller, I just stuck to Happy and instructed the children to call her Aunt Happy. Happy came to our home for the first time shortly after Ingrid was born. So this would be Stephen's stepmom. She smiled broadly and said, "How terrific." When she looked at the new baby, her tone of voice and her inflection were the same as Nelson's, and this caught me by surprise. She was smiling and friendly during the whole visit, and I assumed that must surely be how she came by her name. I guess I wasn't the only member of the family who noticed the uncomfortable position in which many of the Rockefellers found themselves right after the wedding. John D. Rockefeller III, for instance, began to invite the younger generation to private luncheons. He was an advocate of quiet strength through unity like his father, and his deep care and genuine concern were felt by all of us. The subtle regrouping was a constructive effort on his part. It gave us an opportunity to express our opinions and experiences, which opened the way to a better understanding of each other and the family as a whole. Among the young Rockefeller cousins, I came to admire John D. Rockefeller IV very much. I couldn't think of anyone else who could have carried the name better. I learned he had left college to go to Japan to study as an ordinary student. When he returned to the United States, he finished studying for his degree. Later, he married an intelligent, beautiful, and charming girl, Sharon, whose father was Senator Percy of Illinois. They settled into a political life of their own and switched to the Democratic Party, largely due to the influence, I believe, of the Kennedy family. This break with tradition must have been as difficult for Jay as the decision to study philosophy and religion had been for Stephen. I can remember a personal discussion I had with Jay not long before his marriage. I gave him an honest opinion of marriage based on my feelings about Stephen and me. He listened carefully, but his knowing smile told me his love would conquer the difficulties that we had discussed so easily and freely. Hope Spencer, the daughter of John D. Rockefeller III, once told me how guilty she felt being pregnant and sitting at her father's table when he discussed the problem of overpopulation. So I thought that was really interesting right there. On page 162, she says, I found it strange that J. Rockefeller was the only person there who drove a fancy sports car, but great that he didn't feel guilty about doing so. Sometime I wondered if the family had interest in the Volkswagen company because the Bug was what so many of them drove. And that's really interesting to learn also because of if y'all are familiar with Jamie Hanshaw, Jay Dyer's wife, she talks about like the 3 V's on the it's also in her book also the either the Hollywood ones or the other ones that she did um with the va va va, the VVV, and how it's symbolic with them. They use it quite a bit. So that's interesting to read that this family was interested in Volkswagen particularly. And if you know the history about the Volkswagen, you know that Germany is they're the ones that had started it. It says the older generation of Rockefellers had its annual formal meeting too. After the yearly Rockefeller luncheon on Christmas Day, at the brothers' meeting, as it was called, the only woman in attendance was their sister, Miss Mouse. Stephen tried to explain what went on at these gatherings, and it sounded as impressive as the United Nations Security Council sessions. So it says that the first Christmas after Miss Rockefeller and Happy were married, we invited Stephen's mother to spend Christmas Eve with us. Everything was prepared in Norwegian American tradition. At the table, Stephen read the Christmas story from the Bible and prayed for both our families. After dinner, I sang some carols as well as I could, accompanying myself with chords on the harp lick Stephen had bought me in Norway. Christmas Day, our family, along with Stephen's brother, his sisters, and their respective families, assembled at 810 Fifth Avenue. Divorce and remarriage produced strange mixtures at holidays and family gatherings. It seemed ironic, for instance, that although Stephen's father would not be there, he lived in the same apartment building 1 floor below. I had visions of an elevator door opening and producing a blend of everyone. Somehow, though, the concern and love that everyone felt for Miss Rockefeller and shared that day made me feel good. Adults and their problems were momentarily forgotten because of the joy of the grandchildren. And to this day, Miss Rockefeller carries on the traditional celebration of the major holidays with all her children and grandchildren. It is a strong thread of continuity in they greatly value. And then later on, right here, it says, briefly, tranquility returned to our married life, but this was abruptly shattered one day, at least for me, when I saw a half-addressed envelope to an unknown doctor on our foyer table. When I asked Stephen about the letter, he told me that he was now regularly visiting a psychoanalyst. Yeah, that's interesting too, because you don't know about these MK Ultra doctors. It says, while in Norway, I couldn't get my mind off the fact that Stephen was sharing his most intimate thoughts and our personal problems with the paid listener, even though I could still hear him reassuring me that a good psychoanalyst does not alter the patient's personality. I was still worried. He just helps you become more of what you are, Stephen had told me, and function better because you know yourself better. I didn't believe that either. She says, I wrote the doctor a childish and extremely rude letter expressing my disapproval of the whole matter. After that, I gave up and tried to bury the man in my mind as I would a bad dream. But I didn't want him to think I had problems more severe than a momentary tantrum, nor did I want him to discuss my possessive, obsessive personality with Stephen. So later, I wrote him a letter of apology. It was during this stay in Norway that I was shocked, along with the rest of the world, to learn of President Kennedy's assassination. Stephen wrote me a very informative and sad letter in which he told me about his grief and about the regal manner in which Miss Kennedy had conducted herself, setting an example for the country. Stephen also told me he believed President Johnson was a sound and capable man of who would be able to pull the country together. After this terrible shock, as far as the Republican Party goes, he said, Mr. Nixon has the most to gain. She says, I was really proud of my Americanization and thought I had the best of two worlds. I soon added to American statistics in another way. Ingrid was only a few months old when I thought I might be pregnant again. After my suspicions were confirmed by the doctor, Stephen and I had a long talk about our apartment and the undesirability of raising three small children in the city and transporting everyone to and from Pocantico every single weekend. We decided to give up our apartment and move to Terrytown full time. Okay, so she got pregnant again. Oh, and then this. Oh my goodness. Look, listen to this, guys. This reminds me of a movie. She says, another time I had been given a beautiful mink jacket by Stephen's parents, and I couldn't wait to wear that in the park. Stephen and I were dressed like ads from a Sunday supplement. No one could possibly have mistaken me for a maid or a nurse that day. Proudly, I wheeled Stevie's carriage through the zoo. We went very close to the monkey cage, and a gorilla came up to the bars and proceeded to spit all over my face and new coat. This reminds me of what happened on like The Omen on part 1 when they're trying to take little Jamie into the zoo and the monkeys go crazy. I'm sorry about my birds. They are just, I'm talking and they're trying to learn how to talk. So they are talking just as much. It says every Sunday, rain or snow, Stephen took the children to church, sometimes carrying Ingrid in his arms. I accompanied them only occasionally. My vision of becoming a minister's wife was coming closer and closer to actuality. Many times I left the little church after Stephen had delivered the sermon, feeling guilty that I could not share my husband's enthusiasm for the religious life. I don't think I was the only member of his family who felt that way either. One day, a caption in the Daily News asked my question for me. Will Rocky's son go into the ministry? It says that Christmas, Stevie presented his father with an equally priceless charcoal drawing of some gravestones with crosses everywhere because my daddy works in the cemetery, he said. Okay, it says in July, Stephen, the two children, and I drove to Maine. On the way, we stopped at Deerfield Academy to visit Dr. Frank L. Boyden, the longtime headmaster to the school. As he was giving us a tour of the campus, someone helped himself to my camera, which I had carefully left on Dr. Boyden's porch. It was especially embarrassing because we had just been told about the strict discipline of the school. Dr. Boyden apologized and assured me that the camera would be retrieved and he would bring it to me personally in Maine. But he arrived at Rest House as the retreat in Maine was called without the camera. He raised the subject only once, expressing deep regret. It wasn't as deep as mine because I had just mastered the complex camera and become able to use it properly. While we spent some time together that afternoon, I was struck by similarities between the headmaster of Deerfield and John D. Rockefeller Jr. I could see now why Stephen admired him so much and why I was able to feel so comfortable and so much at ease with and at the same time so respectful of Dr. Boyden. I wonder if there's any relationship to there being that that the families kind of like marry into each other and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, it says Jennifer was born October 1st, 1964. She was a big 8 pounds, 6 ounces and healthy. Um, It says, congratulations, Anne-Marie. Read Stephen's card on my night table in the hospital. I could see that our third child will look more like a Rockefeller than a Rasmussen. Her eyes were dark and her facial structure resembled that of her granny, Aunt Mary, and her father. Stevie was upset that he hadn't gotten a brother to play with, but his father sued him by saying nobody can choose. In this case, only God. It says, shortly after Jennifer was born, I was sitting with Miss David Rockefeller, who looked at the Navajo necklace, the wedding present from Stephen that I was wearing, and exclaimed, how extraordinary, Mia. Did you know that it is a special piece of jewelry worn by Indian women and is a sign of fertility? That evening, I took the necklace off, carefully put it in a box, and shut that box away in a drawer. There comes a point when even superstition helps. Wow. It says that even if the house could not be rebuilt, the land itself was worth the asking price. We purchased the property jointly, and Ornelia, as the house was called, it meant Valley of the Snake because the constant sunshine in the area made it a perfect place for copperheads. Was the only home we ever owned together. So they had a house in the district called Valley of the Snakes. Okay, she says on September 28th, 1966, I wrote only Fairy Tale Night because no elaboration seemed necessary. But by October of 1966, my mood was quite different. My feelings were like a yo-yo. And clearly at this point, I was very down. Will I ever feel free and contented again? The fleeting moments of peace have all but disappeared once more, along with my lust for life. I have many emotional sores that always seems to be aching. Where am I going with my constant dreaming? I have only one wish in front of me, and that is to be loved for what I might become. However, intelligence and feelings seem to be two different matters, each working in its own way, usually mutually exclusive. I must try to find a way out of my difficulties with my own resources and willpower. I must become somebody in my own right, apart from anyone and anything in the Rockefeller family. So on this, I think she just wanted attention, is what it seems like. She was definitely emotional. Okay, it says on page 183, one day a friend told me that the Scandinavian was teaching a course called The Science of Creative Intelligence. I became interested immediately. Perhaps someone from my own background could understand how my mind worked or why it didn't work. And with this understanding, he might be able to teach me how to be creatively intelligent. When I met the gentleman, he assured me that it would not be difficult to give up the tools whereby I could develop in a natural way my full mental potential. He promised that the transcendental meditation I was going to learn would have spontaneous and automatic results. So here we've got stuff that David Lynch delves into, the one that helped create Twin Peaks. So Okay, it says after the performance, this is on page 198. The party proceeded to Delmonico's hotel where we sat around a tiny table and a band played loud music. The walls were decorated with Egyptian pharaohs, and Stephen kept trying to find a symbolic meaning in this. I was just trying to have a good time. Crown Prince Harold asked me to dance. I discovered that I felt very comfortable with him, and soon I was unreservedly telling him that when I was a little girl, I had dreamed of living happily ever after with him in his castle. I quickly added that when I came to America, my dream changed to one about being with Stephen and the rest of my life. I said to the Crown Prince, I guess many girls dreamed of being in a castle with you. Only special girls like you dream that, he said. And I thought he was comparing me to his beloved Sonia, who was also a commoner. Okay, it says at an informal discussion that Stephen and I were invited to, this time at the big house, I sat next to Dr. Henry Kissinger of Harvard University on a love seat. Stephen had told me he was a brilliant man who was giving his father political advice. I can remember trying to concentrate on the discussion, but Dr. Kissinger had a number of personal mannerisms that I found distracting. What comes back to me now is my effort to pay close attention and not one single brilliant remark by him or anybody else. It says, my friend was an avid Rockefeller support who believed I could make a real contribution to the governor's campaign. So this is when Nelson Rockefeller was running to be the the campaign. So they got her to do it because she's Norwegian, and they never, I guess they didn't have that. So now they were going to use her for that to basically get those votes. It says, I called the governor to see what he thought of forming an organization to actively seek support from an ethnic group. When I told him that there were more than 12 million Americans of Scandinavian descent in the United States and that they constituted an influential group politically, he became tremendously enthusiastic. He was further impressed by my offer to be a Rockefeller for Rockefeller and laughed when I said, if the Kennedys can do it, so can the Rockefellers. It says, when little Stevie was told about my projected travels, he said, oh, mommy, do you have to go? I told him that I was going to work hard for his grandfather. Grandfather, you'll have to look hard to find a better man than granddaddy, mommy, he said. And from then on, his prayers were amended with the plea, and please make granddaddy president of the United States. Wow. My method of campaign was labeled soft sell, but it was the style I knew best, and it proved to be effective. I was really out of my element whenever any serious question of policy came up, and played it safe by saying the governor can speak for himself on that matter. I continued to win votes for Mr. Rockefeller in the best way I knew how. Really, the only way, by talking about myself, Stephen, the children, the Rockefeller family, and hobbies, preferring to leave Vietnam, civil rights, and other American problems to the rest of the Rockefellers who had spent whole lifetime studying such matters. It says, it seems strange to me to still have so many Americans interested and intrigued by my romantic marriage. Even in the midst of a presidential campaign, Miss Rockefeller, how did you meet your husband? I thought the whole world knew that. Miss Rockefeller, what is it like to be married to a Rockefeller? So she was getting questions like that. It says, after my expenditure of energy on behalf of his father, Stephen admitted that the lure of politics was drawing him more and more into the center of the campaign, but he described himself as the behind the scenes idea man. When people asked him about his father's chances in Miami, he would say he wants the presidency. He believes he can do it. So I say more power to him. Anne-Marie and I are doing what we can to help him. Stephen did emerge from behind the scenes and mostly discussed issues. One day, the two of us were interviewed by a reporter. And among other things, Stephen said, I would like to see my father listen to the voice of my generation. As a father, he has always been an open-minded man. He gave us all an education you couldn't get from school or from TV, a consciousness of what is going on. Soon all the campaigning was over, and Stephen and I retreated to Maine for a long Labor Day weekend with the children before we went to Miami. The results of that disastrous convention are well known. So the conservative Republican delegates chose Mr. Nixon over the liberal divorced Governor Rockefeller. So that's what happened there. The country did not want a divorced president. It says that when I saw Mr. Rockefeller lose in Miami, his face seemed relieved, and I detected some sort of inner release. It says over here, the only sad faces after the convention belonged to those few supporters who had already imagined themselves settled in Washington giving advice to the chief. There was a joke that Dr. Kissinger was Mr. Rockefeller's congratulatory gift, that Dr. Was his gift to Mr. Nixon after the convention. Mr. Rockefeller's real followers looked forward to another 4 years of dreams as New York's chiefly pointed at least New York State, if not the country, in the right direction. He was very appreciative of his loyal supporters as expressed in a letter to me shortly after the convention. And this was the letter that he wrote her. It says Nelson Rockefeller wasn't the only loser in the campaign. Whatever brief periods of happiness and peace Stephen and I had enjoyed as a couple seemed to fade away entirely when the excitement and social whirl that had enveloped me this past year came to an end. Those moments were buried under the larger measurements of time, the weeks and months and years that we had been steadily growing apart. The storybook romance and the fairy tale marriage had turned into a tragic saga, read by many and understood by too few. This is about the kids, I think. Indeed, they did experience love from both of us. They laugh and cry and are not afflicted with the societal imposed facade. How, having failed each other so miserably, we were so conscientious regarding the children, I shall never know. I think this was her father had passed away. And Miss Rockefeller wrote her a letter that says, Mia, darling, I can imagine the pain that you were going through. It certainly was a good thing that you and the children were there this summer. It must have brought him happiness to have you around him these past few weeks. You will always be glad you were able to do this. Losing one's father is a very sad thing and leaves one with a real ache in the heart. You can treasure memories of a wonderful father He was truly a very dear and special man. Everyone who met him or knew him felt this. It helps to know others share your loss. Somehow one always could communicate with him in a sort of human way. I am sure you have a great many problems to decide upon, one right after the other. Dear Mia, I wish I were there right now to give you a big hug. If I can help by coming and taking the children, do let me know. From your affectionate mother-in-law, Mary C. Rockefeller. Um, and I think they are talking about a divorce in these last couple of pages. She told him, dear Stephen, well, Stephen, did you ever think that I might be losing a husband, but gaining three children? At least I am needed and loved. For the past years, I have felt neither in our home. We certainly were two lonely figures who made a big mess of our lives by trying to achieve harmony together. I finally am becoming quenched of the incredible thirst for your love and never seemed forthcoming. No longer will you find me begging for your affection. I had to get so low before I realized I could be so strong. Not yet, but perhaps someday I will be able to laugh and look at the world with untired eyes. I will always like you, Stephen, but someday I will be free of loving you. For me, that I love has been like a disease. For me, that love has been like a disease. You are intelligent and rich, but still poor. You might be surprised to find you need me or someone like the natural girl you married to make you feel whole and make you forget about your name. As usual, you are right in your realistic assessment of our situation. I too am beginning to see it clearly, Anne-Marie. So they ended up getting divorced. And on the very, very last page, she says, it is not how many times you fall, it is how many times you are able to get up. So maybe at last I have become more of a realist. I wish to think so at least, but I know I'll always be romantic in some ways. I have a recurrent daydream about the wedding of one of our children and about how I will dance just once more with Stephen and say Guggen to him again, and after that be silent. By that time, I am certain another Miss Stephen C. Rockefeller will be waiting to dance with her husband. But the music does not stop. Love is all around. Yes, I am still romantic, but I am not going to let my feelings take over. I know that I have learned from my illusions. This is how one love story can end. And this was March 1974. The whole book is pretty good. It's really, really, I think it's a pretty rare book to find, but you can find it over here on the Internet Archive. This is where I find some books that I'm looking for that I can't because they're not in print anymore. I'll come over here and do it. All right, well, that's the end of part 3 of Anne-Marie Rasmussen's. I'm probably gonna do a movie next. I'll probably talk about a movie. And then just go from there. Thank y'all for staying this whole time with me. And don't forget to like, subscribe, Cinemagic Bookshots over on YouTube.